Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon, episode 65, Dr. Larrey and Medical Care During the Napoleonic Age. Before we begin, I'd like to remind all of our listeners and supporters that if you'd like to donate to the show monetarily, please go to patreon.com/Generals and Napoleon, where we have ad-free content and bonus episodes. If you'd like to support the podcast non-monetarily, please give us a follow on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or anywhere podcasts are heard. And if you're feeling extra generous, please give us a positive rating on those listening platforms. Now, on with the show. I am super excited for this episode. I have a very special guest, Mick Crumplin, who's a retired general surgeon over in England. He's written 5 books on hospital care during the Napoleonic era, and we have him on the line today, and we're happy to have him. How are you, Mick?
I'm fine, thanks, John. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. Like I said, Mick has written several books on the hospital care and medical care during the Napoleonic period, which you can find on Amazon. How did you kind of get into studying that period?
Nobody had really put together the human aspects of conflict, surgery, and medicine in this period in a big way. There have been bits and pieces written, but it really needed pulling together. And I think surgery is essentially a pragmatic subject. And so I love the instruments, the wounds, the challenges, and how they managed with the lack of information that we have today.
Indeed. And the gentleman we're going to discuss today, he really was a trailblazer, was he not, Dr. Larrey?
He was.
What do you think? Well, I guess we can kind of get into this, but I think it's hard for people to comprehend medical care and hospital care at this time was so, I don't want to use the word archaic, but it was, obviously it's not what we have today. How would you describe medical care of battlefield wounds and injuries during this time?
Well, I think you can imagine that medical care at these times, in the face of ignorance, poor hygiene, lack of good nursing care, anesthesia, lack of antiseptic practice, also delay in removing men who are sick or injured from the battle area was at best primitive, with appalling outcomes. Pain relief almost totally inadequate, and prolonged waiting on the field resulted in fatal hemorrhages and inevitable sepsis. And there was no proper triage or evacuation process, and only in the mid-18th century was some talk of some protection in Europe, with sanctuary given to the wounded soldiers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just think it's fascinating. And not only that, the threat of disease. I know during Napoleon's invasion of Russia, a great many of his soldiers was not taken down by weather or bullets, but by typhus.
Yeah, and climate.
Yep, and climate. That's right. Well, let's dive in, because I'm really excited to talk about Larrey, and he just really strikes me as one of the more noble characters during this era. He was born in July 1776 in France, near the Pyrenees region of Spain, but he was not born into a noble family and was orphaned at age 13. Can you tell us a bit about his upbringing?
Yeah, he was born in the little French town of Borodino in the foothills of the Pyrenees to the north. And the Larreys were a fairly humble family, I guess, living in quite a remote area. Dominique Jean was born just 3 years after the 7 Years' War, and his great-grandfather, Jean-Francois, was a surgeon at Tarbes to the north in that region, and one of his sons was Dominique, a surgeon in Tarbes. His other son was a farmer, and that was Dominique's grandfather, who had 2 sons, and Uncle Alexis became a surgeon at St. Joseph's Hospital in Toulouse. That was Dominique Larrey's uncle, and his father became a master shoemaker. He was in poor health, but he brought up his children at local schools. He had a sister and a brother. So Jean-Dominique was educated at the village school run by the priest, Abbé Grasseur, and imbibed with good, solid Christian principles. Larrey was predictably a curious boy with a true love of his surroundings, helping in the workshop, doing chores, and walking miles with his mother to Bagné de Bigorre, which was a town with a market. and she regaled her sons with stories and practical homely and rural knowledge. But sadly, Dominique's father died, and he was 13 only, his son, in the spring of 1780. So Larrey was sent to Toulouse to learn medicine and Uncle Alexis. And his primary education was rather lacking. So he was sent to a college called Esquile College. And thereafter, Alexis at Toulouse taught him the crafts of medicine. And at 19, Larrey won the first student prize at the hospital. And at 20, a year later, he won the first prize to become a house surgeon and soon wrote a thesis on bone tuberculosis.
Right. Yeah, I think it's fascinating. You know, he, like you mentioned, he completed a very rigorous apprenticeship and then became a surgeon in the Navy. And at the age of 21, he was deployed to Newfoundland in Canada, where he became the youngest surgeon in the French Royal Navy. Do you think he was just, you mentioned he was curious, was he exceptionally bright or hardworking or both?
I think both of these. He obviously was a good student and a committed learner and had a lot to gain, and obviously had seen his various relatives do well, no doubt. But anyway, after a year in Toulouse, Larrey longed to do more and expand his practice. And he was being gradually consumed, I gather, with a burgeoning Republican spirit. So he walked to Paris with his uncle's patronage and enrolled in a course of lectures at the Hotel Dieu Hospital in Paris under the great Pierre Desault. The impoverished Larrey failed to get any job at Les Invalides and sought advice of a patron, Antoine Louis, Secretary of the Royal Academy of Surgery. And he told him that there were jobs coming up to appoint naval surgeons in Brest. So Larrey and a friend went to Brest, and en route they made an important visit to a little village of Bourg-Hesson, Ambroise Paré's birthplace. Paré was an exemplar surgeon in the 16th century who did many great things, and Larrey wanted to be like him, I guess. So he was innovative, intelligent, and at the siege of Metz in 1552, the people realized they stood a chance of survival with this great surgeon in their presence. And I think that's what Larrey wanted to do. So he was disappointed when he got to Brest because all the naval appointments were cancelled. But after he got a bit of money sort of teaching students anatomy and surgery, and he was appointed to the 18-gun sloop, the Vigilante, which in the spring of 1787 sailed off on fishery and commercial protection duties. Right. He seemed to be hardworking, dutiful, and mindful of responsibilities, checked his ship out, saw he had the correct stuff on board, and ignorant of the cause of scurvy at this time, he saw to it that the sailors drank water and vinegar, which was the accepted treatment or prevention at that time. And he ended up with only 24 of the 123 on the sick list. Most of them were scorbutic, suffering from scurvy. Anyway, he managed a couple of small outbreaks of typhus and smallpox, and he came back after 6 months, landing at Brest to make his way back to Paris.
Yeah, he gets back to Paris in 1789, just in time for the French Revolution. He allegedly improvised an ambulance to treat the wounded at the storming of the Bastille. Do you think he supported the revolution itself or just the freedom of ideas that came with it?
Well, he now had some money, and Desault took him on as a trainee before the Bastille was stormed. He attended board, patients, and lectures, and one surgeon at the Invalides Hospital in Paris impressed him greatly, a guy called Raphael Sabatier. And through improper patronage, Larrey failed to get the post of an assistant surgeon at the Hotel Dieu, which was an important hospital in Paris. But in July 1789, the city, as you know, erupted in revolutionary fervor. And Larrey, believing strongly in equality and fairness and the reward of hard work, being a right to privilege. So as a supporter of the revolution, he helped other students raid an arsenal. And with an armed band of around 1,500 students and other people, he got involved in the assault on the Bastille, and soon was helping back in hospital with Desault with clearing up the casualties. That was his first experience of conflict surgery. Cleaning up wounds, removing in-driven debris was part of his and other surgeons' repertoire. That's a forerunner of what we call debridement. Here, under Desault, Larrey started to learn about the severe consequences of delayed amputation, and yet he admired Desault as a surgeon. 1781, he met his future wife and thwarted in his marriage proposal because he got nothing to offer her, as it were, at that time. And with this fired up, massive citizen army, burgeoning army, its declaration of war on Prussia and Austria, conscripted into the army of the Rhine, Surgeon Major Larrey set off to war.
Yeah, and he serves at the front lines of the Army of the Rhine during the War of the First Coalition. It was during this time that he developed the idea of the modern field army surgery with field hospitals and ambulance corps. Was this a radically different concept than what came before this period?
Yes, it was, because don't forget, all the casualties had delay. The battle had to be over before they were properly collected and so forth. What soldiers need is confidence in their care when they're fighting on the front. It's a huge morale boost. And the soldier citizens of the new republic, their care was paramount. Failure in these duties could be punished severely. And in 1792, the victory at Valmy established the highly motivated French citizen army, living off the land with an endless supply of recruits. But casualties were ill cared for, and Larrey, posted to the rear, was so frustrated by all this, things had to change.
Yeah, and he I think he just thought down and thought about how he can make things better. And one of the innovations he came up with was so-called flying ambulances. And I read that after seeing the speed of the flying artillery that the French army used, basically cannons hauled around by horses, Larrey kind of modeled this rapid transport of the wounded with train drivers and litter bearers. I think the Battle of Metz in 1793 was the first time he proved the value of this system.
Well, as the conflicts with the Republican army against its nervous Bourbon supporting allies raged on, and having failed to bring out the wounded by horse transport, which he tried first, as you say, he noted the speed of movements of light horse artillery. So he thought he'd try something different. He wanted to minimize the delay in therapy and provide morale-boosting frontline support. So in 1792, on the River Main near Frankfurt, Larrey accosted two senior men, one a general, Custine, and the other a quartermaster, a very important guy, Villemanzi, and explained his ideas of this horse-driven ambulance service. And he realized that the system of evacuation could well mimic the artillery transport system. So he created a few ambulances which went into action around Königsberg. As 1792 came to its end, Larrey, in various hard-pressed situations, started to operate and dress the wounded actually in the front line. Another first for Larrey, frontline support. 1793, of course, Britain declared war on France. And then during one difficult action in the spring of 1793, Larrey performed an amputation on the field. This is really not ever recorded before, except for completion amputations, that sort of thing. But the French army had a burgeoning system of frontline surgical support. And near Mainz, Larrey did something else. He berated and halted some fleeing French soldiers who were running away from battle, and drove off some Prussians who were stripping a few wounded casualties and about to kill them. And Larrey proceeded to treat these men, having driven off their enemies. But anyway, Larrey received great acclaim from the convention. That was very important. General Desai became a very capable general under Napoleon.
Very good.
Yeah, yep. And he made great friends with Larrey. Our surgeon's reputation had him recalled to Paris, where he was to set up his ambulance system in other armies of the Republic. The convention and the terror reigned in Paris, and there was a terrible shake-up and bloodshed, and all the medical facilities in France were disrupted and so forth. Now, Larrey was given the position of senior medical officer to accompany a force to Corsica, but that didn't happen. So he spent a bit of time pottering around in northern Spain.
Well, let's briefly talk about triage, which seems like a no-brainer to us now, where you treat the most, I guess, violent injuries or worst injuries first, and then you kind of work your way down to the not so injured or slight wounds. Why was I know Larrey had he established a rule in the French army for this, but why was this such a revolutionary idea?
Well, because I think if you're a doctor on a battlefield, you tend to look after your own, look after nearby people, treat officers and senior people, and really not give it much thought. And it wasn't a completely new issue. I mean, triage is taken from the old French word trier, as you probably know, to separate. But sophisticated practice that we face today is very different from what Larrey conceded. What he did say was that you do need to treat the most seriously injured by the most capable people in the first instance. And that is a very important concept. So the beginning of triage has to be there. And you might have to remember that the concept was described briefly in the Edwin Smith papyruses in Egypt during the Holy Roman Empire and in the early 18th century by John Atkins in the British Royal Navy, but it never took off. But I think Larrey would have infiltrated his teams with this, and he just emphasized that all serious cases required people like him to operate on them. And he said, in true humanitarian Republican spirit, treating the wounded according to the observed gravity of their injuries and the urgency for medical care regardless of rank or nationality, which is a fine issue, and we all agree with that. But if you look in detail at other surgeons who said this, you'd still find a tendency to treat your own rather than the enemy's first. And not infrequently, Larrey did stick true to his principles. He did treat enemy casualties well, and he would refuse to undertake less important duties when faced with an overwhelming workload. Larrey had his priorities, no doubt.
1794, Larrey first meets Napoleon, and clearly Napoleon was not a scientist, but appreciated and encouraged scientific advancement. I think Napoleon gets an unfair rap that he didn't care about the common soldier. But again, at the time, maybe it was a royal thing where they didn't care about, the common soldiers. They only cared about like the officers and the nobles. Do you think Napoleon was a little different in this case?
Well, I think we have to say that he did first meet Bonaparte in 1794, and a board of health was created in Italy. He set up his evolving ambulance system. It's now that it's really taking off. And just to mention this system first, it had 340 men in 3 divisions of about 113 men each. Lots of staff, NCOs, drivers, instrument carriers, orderlies, farriers, early stretcher bearers. And each division had 12 ambulances, 8 two-wheelers and 4 heavy vehicles. And Larrey really at this time was entering into Bonaparte's glittering entourage at Montebello Castle, following all the victories. And at Udine in North Italy, he put on a show with his ambulances and was very generously praised by General Bonaparte. Yes, Bonaparte was keen to evolve culture and science. He was fascinated by these things, was surrounded even at Montebello by scholars, artists, and professors. And I reckon he had dreams of emulating Alexander of Macedon, really.
Yeah, and along those lines, in 1798, Napoleon begins Egyptian conquest and brings Larrey along with him. And the other ever-active Larrey establishes medical school in Cairo. He studies new afflictions that the French troops encountered in the desert. And he's also wounded at the siege of Acre, Larrey. And there's a famous painting of Napoleon visiting his soldiers that had been infected with a plague. Of all Napoleon's many campaigns, do you think this one needed the most medical care?
Well, yeah, I'll come on to that in a sec. But as you say, at 32, Larrey was no doubt fascinated to accompany Napoleon's military and scientific expedition to Egypt to thwart Britain's communication with India and the East. But Larrey, as usual, performed with great efficiency. His first plus point was treating a nasty horse kick that was inflicted on Bonaparte's leg by draining the bruise. He managed cases of ophthalmia, dysentery, and suppurating wounds and ulcers in the intense heat, and that shouldn't be underplayed. But now it was the time that Larrey was really assessing the importance of military medicine on his commander. He even created mobile litters for soldiers, one each side of a camel, light litters, so the camel could take the wounded out of battle.
Right.
He was widely praised by General Bonaparte and was given. He represented the subject of surgery in the Institute of Egypt, which was founded by Bonaparte.
Mm-hmm.
Then we get the trip up to Syria, which was an interesting and ill-understood expedition. And Larrey worked tirelessly to provide help for civilian and military casualties. Interestingly, talking about the former, at Jaffa, a street entertainer, an Egyptian with a pet monkey on his shoulder, came for treatment with a head wound. But Larrey dressed that. But when he saw the monkey also had a sword cut, he treated the monkey's head. And the monkey became very attached to Larrey after this.
Also, I didn't know about his veterinarian care as well. So yeah,
I guess so. Toussaint Arrighi was an ADC to Marshal Berthier and a relative of Bonaparte, and he was shot through the neck, and blood was spouting from one of his great vessels in the neck. And Larrey praised the young grenadier of the guard who'd placed a finger in each wound to stop the hemorrhage, but he dragged him. But the thing about this story is that Larrey took little notice of the shrapnel exploding above his head, and his hat and parts of his clothing were riddled with fragment injuries. So he was obviously a fairly fearless guy in action.
Yeah. And just relating to your earlier story, he's scaring away the Prussians that were trying to strip injured soldiers. Like he carried a sword. He carried a sword, and he would go into battle when needed.
Well, don't forget, all medical officers in all countries carried weapons because they were not protected, as you know, till 1860s by the Red Cross and all the rest of it.
Right.
So yeah, of course they were armed, and they did have to fight sometimes. Yale, you mentioned, but. At Aboukir, Marshal Murat, this flamboyant guy you know about, was shot through the neck also. And Larrey had to feed him by a tube put into the wound of his neck, which he did eventually. And he was also present at the post-mortem done on General Kleber, who was assassinated in Egypt after Napoleon had left. Anyway, he was invited to go back to France with his general, and he refused. And he said, my job's to stick here with all the wounded and sick in Europe. I can't go back now. And Napoleon had prematurely fled back to France for other political reasons. And Larrey didn't get the best press for this. And he wasn't in Paris when he got back later to receive the duly merited honors from the Egyptian campaign. But that's a good thing that Larrey did. He was true to his principles and his patience. But
and I think that's a lot of bravery. Like when many of the officers were clamoring to get out of Egypt and go back with Napoleon, he turned it down. He didn't. Like you said, he wanted to stay with the soldiers. That's amazing.
I mean, almost the same thing happened in Russia, didn't it? After Moscow, same thing.
Correct. Upon Larrey's final return to France in 1801, he remained attached to Napoleon, becoming chief of staff, chief surgeon to the Imperial Guard. And I think that's a pretty lofty position, don't you think, to be in charge of Napoleon's personal bodyguard's health?
Yeah, it was. I mean, when he got back, he was mollified a bit to be made at the Tuileries, the first consul, which Napoleon was by then, giving him medical care of the consular guard. It was rather less than Larrey had hoped, but he got a great honor, as you say. Anyway, he mimicked the first consul's immense energy for reorganizing systems and resuming teaching duties at the Val-de-Grâce Hospital in Paris, establishing courses of military instruction, engaging in surgical education, and so on. And at this time, about 1803-4, a lot of the educational facilities in medicine were re-established, and Larrey had to join in with these new systems, and he had to obtain his doctorate in medicine to comply. So he then got his doctorate of medicine, was Dr. Larrey. In 1804, as you know, Bonaparte was crowned emperor. He instigated the new order of the Légion d'honneur. And Larrey had one of the first medals, and so he was pleased about that. But a year later, France had to stagger under the resounding defeat of the Franco-Spanish navies, and Bonaparte abandoned for other reasons his plans to invade England.
Mm-hmm.
Then followed the actions at Ulm and Austerlitz, adding more and more jewels to the emperor's crown. And Larrey now was still medical chief to the now 10,000 strong imperial rather than consular guard.
He worked hard for Napoleon. He doesn't strike me as a blind follower of Napoleon like a Duroc or a Bessier. Do you think he was somewhat resentful that all these soldiers he builds relationships with were getting slaughtered out on the field, or do you think it was just part of his job to take care of these guys?
You don't read an awful lot about Larrey's personal view of the emperor's politics and strategies. I think he's often too busy with his own worries and his own business to write about that. I may be wrong about this, but that's what I felt. But I think that he had plenty to do always, and always looking for honors, promotion, and more money, and so forth.
Yeah, well, pursuant to that, in 1807, during the horrific Battle of Eylau, Larrey had set up a field hospital, and Caulaincourt was one of Napoleon's top aides, attempted to commandeer the hospital to be repurposed for the emperor's quarters. Larrey refused to move his hospital, and Caulaincourt threatened to inform Napoleon of this. And Larrey replied, quote, "Do as you please, but you may be sure that His Majesty will decide in my favor," end quote. And sure enough, Napoleon agreed with Larrey, saying his wounded soldiers take priority over the emperor's comfort. I think this is two things. Larrey knew his emperor, and the other thing is Napoleon realized that his troops were and that his troops' health were a top priority. Don't you think?
I absolutely agree. And I have to remember that Napoleon was looking for brownie points as much as Larrey. And I think to have commandeered a house full of sick and injured who'd have to be moved out for his own headquarters would have been very bad publicity. But nevertheless, his relationship with Larrey was enough to know what was right in the public way.
Yeah.
So 1807 heralded this new coalition against the Bonaparte regime, and now facing the Russian and Prussian forces on East Prussia on the frozen wastes of Eylau. He had his hospital back at this big house to the rear. And as you say, General Louis Caulaincourt, master of the king's horse and household, demanded the use. But Larrey pointed out the chalked word hospital on the door and refused to give it up. Caulaincourt reported Larrey to the emperor, who conceded to Larrey, of course, and he therefore attained a moral ascendancy. But that would have annoyed Caulaincourt, and Larrey did upset quite a few people in this way. Not that he did wrong, but he knew how to make enemies and was very stubborn and forthright in the way he did things. Anyway, his frontline dressing station was a huge open barn, and despite the cold, I was very interested that Larrey seemed to be able to perform his digital surgical work without the cold freezing his hands off, which was pretty impressive. He was threatened by a Russian force, but he decided to remain to the last with his wounded men. Luckily, the Russians were beaten off by General Hautpoul, and he had a wounded thigh, came to Larrey for amputation. The general refused Larrey's advice and died 3 days later. Another story of innovation, really, during surgical procedure was a colonel was undergoing an amputation. When the operation started, he was shaking uncontrollably, and so hindering the operation because his limb wouldn't keep still, and he just was a total wreck, understandably. Larrey slapped hard on the face, and the furious colonel soon realized the operation had been completed and all was forgiven.
Larrey said, "I was trying to distract you so you wouldn't notice I was amputating."
Absolutely. And then after that, he was instructed to embalm the body of General Dahlmann, who died in the Battle of Eylau. But Larrey protested that he needed to be with his wounded more than doing this service.
Let's talk briefly about antiseptic, if you don't mind, because I know basically if you're going to have something amputated, they would give you a shot of brandy as your painkiller, but that probably wasn't a good idea because alcohol it thins your blood. So was there any kind of antiseptic at this time?
There is no record of Larrey being particularly clean and washing his wounds carefully. He may well have done. He was a rapid surgeon, and he probably did clean out the wounds of debris and cut off dead tissue. There was no specific administration of alcohol, both internally or applying externally. And obviously the bacterial theory hadn't been introduced, so it couldn't be acted upon. No, I think it's the speed of operation and being relatively clean gave him optimum results for the time.
Yeah. Moving along, there's another intriguing incident which happens during the invasion of Spain with Marshal Lannes. I think it's 1808 or 1809. Do you want to tell this story? I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, it's a good story. In 1808, Larrey followed Bonaparte into Spain, which was his second visit, actually. Remember, he went there briefly earlier. The emperor wanted to replace the Bourbon regime, put his brother Joseph on the throne. Spain erupted, Peninsular War, Bonaparte's Spanish ulcer, and eventually Sir Arthur Wellesley landed in August 1808 at Mondego Bay, just to put in context. And the Peninsular War from the British point of view had begun. Larrey had to treat Marshal Lannes near Tolosa in later 1808. And Lannes, as you say, had fallen under his horse, which had slipped. And the horse continued to struggle on top of the Marshal, which was further compounding the trauma. The Marshal's chest and abdomen were severely bruised. There was probably some damage to tissues and organs at the back of Lannes' body, so, the kidneys, the spleen, that sort of thing, and bruising in what we call the retroperitoneal space. And if this happens, you can get what's called a paralytic ileus. The guts just stop to work. The abdomen swells. You've got a silent, paralyzed abdomen, and it's very dangerous because it's painful. You get dehydrated, and you die. Really, basically, clinical shock. So Larrey treated the soldier with a freshly killed, flayed sheepskin and wrapped it round him, rubbing on emollients and applying gentle enemas, which is probably a not unreasonable thing to do. He's treated with no food by mouth. And he'd remembered this treatment from the time he'd been in Newfoundland, which he noted had been a method used by the Inuits. And with only fluids for sustenance and enemas and time, the Marshal improved. But interestingly, he passed some blood-stained urine afterwards, and that means that his kidneys had definitely been traumatized.
I was doing some research on this. I guess sheepskin's like a natural, it keeps bacteria out, but also keeps your body, it like helps skin recover and organs recover. I guess there's some sort of natural thing about the sheepskin, but it's just fascinating that he learned about it in Newfoundland and then applied it, later on in his life.
It's difficult to think today of a physiological reason for its success, but certainly the Marshal would have been kept warm and at rest. And those are the two things, with God's good grace, will cure the patient ultimately, providing there's no leak of gut contents or peritonitis.
Right.
But after this, I'm just sort of finished off Larrey in Spain. He went on to, with the Guard, to Madrid. And then as soon as John Moore fled out of the country to retreat to Corunna, he travelled on with the pursuing army, chasing the English leopard into the sea. And he got as far as Astorga up in Galicia in northwest Spain, and then Valladolid, where he cared for English sick and wounded soldiers, as well as the French. But in doing so, Larrey caught typhus, which was with the Spanish army, and went back to convalesce in Paris.
Now, later in 1809, Napoleon's back on war footing with Austria. Austria, again, is trying to topple the emperor with some reforms they made in their armies. And the Battle of Aspern-Essling, Marshal Lannes, right before the Battle of Wagram, Marshal Lannes is struck in the knees by a cannonball. And it's a controversial decision, as Lannes later died from post-surgery infection. The controversy was they weren't sure if they should amputate or not. I think Larrey was arguing with a fellow surgeon about it. Do you think they made the right decision there?
Yeah, well, Larrey had set out from Paris in 1809. At the battle you mentioned, Lannes actually went to grieve over the death of a close friend at the battle and sat on a tree trunk with his head in his hands. Sitting there, a ricochet round shot smashed his left knee, tore muscles on the right thigh. And Larry was very distressed because this was another great friend, like Desai had become a good friend. And he actually went to look for other opinions. He sought 2 second opinions. And one of them was against an amputation and the other was for, and Larry was for. So he ended up doing the operation. I think the indication for surgery was correct because damage to a major joint is an absolute indication for amputation at these times, and soon. As soon as the mental state of the patient and a bit of fluid redistribution occurs, you get that leg off, and that's what he did. But he died from sepsis on the 6th day, and that could have happened without surgery and would have done. I don't think Larrey made a bad judgment. He was seeking other opinions and perhaps arguing with the one against amputation. I think Larrey made a good call on that operation. The only thing that he was worried about was losing his friend and making a wrong decision, as thought by others, on this very famous and prominent soldier. But I think he did the right thing. And at this battle, after he'd operated on Lannes, he began to increase significantly his experience of his favored operation, which was disarticulation at the shoulder joint. In other words, removing the whole arm at the shoulder for severe damage. This was an operation he did fast and well.
There's another great story from this battle, and maybe you can confirm it. I've read about it once or twice. Napoleon, because he was in such a rush to get to the Austrian army, they didn't have enough food brought up in time for his soldiers. So Larry came up with a solution for his wounded soldiers, right?
Well, at the same battle, Larry was short of sustenance and rations for his men. And I think this is his commitment at its best. This isn't for publicity, you know, but not to be thwarted. He did prove innovative. And what he did was to use recently deceased horse's meat to make soup initially. And the lack of salt necessitated flavoring the meat with gunpowder. The broth was cooked in cuirasses or breastplates used as pots and other vessels. But as the horse flesh supply dried up, and you do need scores of animals to feed divisions or brigades, you know, you need your butchers. And as the horse flesh dried up, Larry had some nearby picketed horses destroyed and brushing off the complaints of General Boudet, to whom the horses belonged. But he wouldn't have got very far if he complained about that to Napoleon, I guess.
Right.
Anyway, after this sanguinary battle, Larrey's impressive results in treating 1,200 guard casualties, 600 were returned to duty. And after this, Napoleon made Dominique Larrey a baron of the empire. And he came back to France, and then he attended court functions, devoted his energies to the Guard Hospital, teaching, writing his 3-volume memoirs. And then his master declared war on Russia.
In 1812, he accompanies Napoleon's invasion of Russia, and finally get to the bloody Battle of Borodino, which it says he had to perform 200 amputations in that one day, which I can't even imagine. Do you think, and you're a surgeon, do you ever have, do you think Larry had PTSD?
Well, I'll roll that all up into my reply. I think that he was glad to be made surgeon en chef to this Grande Armée of nearly 500,000 men. He's going to get a lot of trouble with many sick and suffering. And there was a lack of doctors, there was a lack of medical supplies and transport, there was a lack of food. And the actions at Vitebsk, Krasno, Smolensk, and so on delivered huge numbers of casualties. And his shortages of dressings and other items were to pose a huge challenge. But Larry ordered parchment rolls from a monastery to be used as splints. He used paper scrambled up for bedding and bark fiber from trees for dressing. In September, as you say, the Battle of Borodino was contested. Larrey's teams were stretched to the limit. You have to remember that there were very few doctors here. They had to conscript medical students, local doctors. They were overwhelmed. They had to treat 9,000 casualties. Larrey treated his teams. And they reckon after the battle, the peasants buried 50,000 bodies after this Pyrrhic victory. And it was recorded by Larrey that he did these 200 in 24 hours amputations. I think we need to just look at that for a minute. I reckon an amputation takes 15 to 20 minutes at the least. Remove a leg in 3 to 5 minutes. Removing a leg is not an amputation, it's removing the leg. You have to tidy the wound, you have to pick up the blood vessels, tie them off, stop all the bleeding, loosen the tourniquet, check the bleeding's doing, tighten up the tourniquet, dress the wound and stitch it, tape it shut and bandages it. So 15 to 25 minutes. It's not just limb removal. That means that how could he possibly have done one amputation every 7 minutes? And I think this is one example, really, of Larrey's exaggeration. And, it's getting into the bad part of Larrey, really, that he didn't probably give. He does sometimes give accreditation to his team members. He does. It wasn't him, it was his teams. And I think many of these driven men are so prone to exaggeration. Now, have he got PTSD? That's a good question. No, I don't think he got PTSD because he doesn't talk of nightmares. He doesn't talk of any disease symptoms or exhaustion. He obviously got extremely tired, but we know that he boasted about himself being one of the most robust soldiers in the army. He didn't worry about upsetting people. And I think on the retreat from Moscow, he describes himself as one of the most robust men in the army. That's a quote. I think he's showing considerable narcissistic features by now. And he was an extremely talented organizer and surgeon and a great role model. But he was vain and immodest and confrontational. There is no doubt about that. But I don't really get the impression that he was war damaged like some men.
Yeah.
He reached Moscow with 20,000 sick and wounded soldiers. When he left 1,200 behind.
Right.
And he survived by walking. But he said, if you stop, sit down by a fire and warm up your legs, you get damage to your circulation and you keep moving. And he always had a thermometer pinned onto the outside of his coat. And he got to Beresina, and there was such respect for him, they carried him shoulder high across the river Beresina so that he could treat casualties on the other side of the river on the retreat.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Just fascinating. Fascinating.
He staggers back to France.
Yeah. Yeah, well, in 1813, Larrey continues to serve Napoleon in the German campaign and all the way up to the emperor's abdication in 1814. He even offers to accompany Napoleon to his exile on Elba, but the emperor refuses the offer. Not many people have a work ethic similar to Napoleon's, but he's in the ballpark. It sounds like he's working hard the whole empire.
I think these two men recognized and admired each other's commitment. The object of their commitment sometimes varied, but Larrey did serve well in the campaigns in Saxony. And after Bautzen, he saved the lives of 48 young recruits, because, of course, Bonaparte was recruiting younger and younger men as they were young men of France were eaten up. But 48 men were accused of self-mutilation. And Larrey took down details of every single man and actually concluded that these were accidents through poor training, poor arms handling. And he managed to convince Napoleon of this. And these men were pardoned and let off and so on. Well, after Dresden, of course, and Leipzig particularly, Larrey was made honorary surgeon to His Majesty. That was something he not the personal surgeon, but the honorary surgeon to His Majesty. And he wanted that post. Mm-hmm. But he survived and worked during some of Napoleon's brilliant last-ditch military actions in France: Craon, Montereux, Léon, finally Arcis-sur-Aube. And then when he abdicated, as you say, Napoleon didn't allow Larrey, to follow him into exile. He came back as Inspector General, Chief of the Armies, First Surgeon of the Guard and of the Hospital of the Guard, and commenced, I suppose one would, ingratiating himself to the restored plump King Louis XVIII.
Yeah. I mean, as the marshals and generals were too, because Louis XVIII was now the king sitting on the throne, and you want to ingratiate yourself with that person.
Yeah.
But in 1815, Napoleon returns, and we have the Battle of Waterloo, where Larrey is again performing at a Herculean level. Do you want to talk about his efforts that day?
Yeah, he would have been based in the middle at the back at Belle Alliance, And I know there was a big ambulance stationed there. And of course, I hadn't really said it before, but one has to remember that the concept of an ambulance is a system of care, not vehicles. So you have all these other ancillaries that I did mention. But anyway, so he worked hard. He was seen probably through a telescope working on the field. And apparently, Wellington's orders were not to fire at him, pointing out the immaculate dedication and bravery of the man to his charges. And he said, the courage and devotion of an age that's no longer ours. And I think what he meant was that Wellington had been witness to many misbehaviors and poor judgments and lack of commitment and delays and inefficiency. But he obviously admired Larrey and just was feeling that sort of commitment was maybe passing a bit here and there. I don't know. But yeah. I think you have to be very careful with the story. It smacks to me as an apocryphal bit, but
yeah, it could be. But I think, like you said earlier, medical doctors were not free from being shot at or killed on the battlefield by the enemy troops. They were not protected by any kind of law or rule, right? It was open season.
Yeah, well, theoretically, they should have had sanctuary, but as you say, particularly the Prussians were horrendous in their management of wounded Frenchmen.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of the Prussians, after the French lose the battle, Larrey is taken prisoner by the Prussians, who manhandled him, stripped him, and we're about to execute him on the spot. What happens to our good doctor?
Well, he gets a head wound when he's riding off the field, when all is done. And he's knocked off his horse and stunned. He gets up and taken prisoner, and he gets on a horse again, being towed away, when he escapes again. And again, he's captured by another picket, Prussian picket. They arrest him, probably quite annoyed, and took him to an officer who wondered if he was actually Napoleon, because he was dressed by Napoleon. Actually, they were actually about to shoot him, and I believe they actually had a man putting a blindfold on his eyes who happened to be a medical man who knew Larrey. Mm-hmm. And Larrey was then spared and sent to Blucher, whose son Larrey had operated on previously after a battle. And so Blucher actually said, look, you go off to Louvain, which actually was a Prussian military hospital after the battle, and go and recover there. Here are 12 Frederick d'Or, they were sort of like guineas, and off you go. And eventually Larrey got permission to come back to Brussels to help with the injured there. And this was clearly a man who, at the end of his career, whatever his failures were, was much revered by so many people.
I just think he was revered by all three armies, the British, the Prussians, and the French.
Well, you have to remember that a lot of they weren't really Belgians then, they were citizens of the Kingdom of Holland, but the Belgians and Dutch had all served in the French army, and the doctors would all be trained and knew Larrey.
Right.
Prussians certainly would have known about him, as did our men. And many of them met him after.
Yeah, he served in Spain, he served in Russia, he served at all the fronts. So yeah. What becomes of the good doctor after the downfall of Napoleon? I know he wrote several books on his medical studies.
Yeah, after Bonaparte's exile, where Bonaparte was tended by various British and Irish surgeons, Larrey had been blacklisted back home because he'd gone back to the emperor. And he managed to retain his position of chief surgeon to the new Royal Guard hospital, because it wasn't the Imperial Guard anymore. He was offered posts in the US, interestingly, Russia, and Brazil to take charge of military medical services of their armies. He refused. In 1820, the Academy of Medicine was created with Larrey amongst the founder members, and he eventually made a full member of the Army Medical Council. He was delighted, wrote his memoirs, and between 1800 and 1840, he published around 30 written works.
Yeah, and I think it's amazing that he had these offers to go overseas, but even when he was impoverished, he turned them down. He wanted to stay in France.
Well, of course, he had family, he had 2 children, his wife, and
Yeah.
He must have established a civilian practice, you see, as well.
Yeah. Well, he passes in 1842 from pneumonia, and I want to get to his legacy, but I want to talk real quick. There's so many things to his legacy. There's a great quote from Napoleon calling Larrey, quote, "the most virtuous man I have ever known. If the army were to erect a monument to any one man, it should be that of Larrey. All the wounded are his family," end quote. What do you think his legacy is, not only for France, but for the world?
Well, just if we can deal with Napoleon Bonaparte's, he wrote an extended praise of Larrey, and he left Larrey a legacy of 100,000 francs. He only got half of it. But when Napoleon III, Bonaparte's cousin, was reinstated, Napoleon III gave Larrey's son Hippolyte the balance to found a school in the village of Borodino, Larrey's birthplace, which was nice.
Oh, that's nice.
I don't know, yeah, the most virtuous man in public and in his performance as a public servant. I think that Larrey deserves that epithet. And he was just such a great committed surgeon, and he had little heart after all this war, like Wellington really after Waterloo. He'd had enough. But he must have continued in his military care and teaching and private practice. He was rather autocratic with his kids, apparently. He acquired a country residence, was elected onto the triumvirate board of the Council of Army Medicine, and also became chief surgeon at Invalides. So, and then Bonaparte dies. He's reinterred, his body brought back from St. Helena to Invalides, where he's now magnificently entombed in pink granite. And in the procession for the reburial, an elderly Larrey, leaning on the arm of his son, trudging along, a bent figure in the freezing weather behind his revered master's cortege. No doubt his mind was full of triumphal and tragic memories. So, and just to finish his story before we get on to the legacy, 2 years later, Larrey sets out to look at some North African hospitals under the auspices of the French Empire. And when he's away in Africa looking at these military hospitals with his son, the news of his wife's illness hurries him back to France. But on the 25th of July, 1842, at Lyon, Larrey dies of bronchopneumonia, the very day that a letter arrives from Larrey's daughter announcing his wife's death. And he's got this legacy. He is definitely one of the most prestigious military surgeons and doctors because of innovation, because of commitment, because of realizing priorities and organizational skills, getting supportive surgical support to the front, getting people out so that even though primitive triage was practiced, it could be carried out. Huge in energy, great surgical skills, the ability to do right, teach well. And his example was always to instill courage and confidence in those who worked and fought with him. He'd taken surgical care right to the front, a service so vital today in modern armies.
Yeah, I know there's a medical award given by NATO to people who provide, to doctors who provide improvements in the provision of healthcare on NATO missions, and it's called their Larrey Award, which I think is pretty impressive.
Yeah, it is, and well deserved.
It's hard to quantify the benefit. I mean, the guy probably saved hundreds, if not thousands, of lives, not only from the battlefield, but his improvements from what came before, don't you think?
I do. I think, you know how history is always being revised these days, and reading between the lines, I think we have to understand that the ambulances weren't universally available. Money ran out. Percy's stretcher-bearing cadre was short-lived. Larrey was very much looking after the pick of the French army. I mean, a little army on its own, 15 to 20,000 Imperial Guard. But the point is that the examples there, we talk about it today, and it must have permeated all down the service de santé. It must have done. Therefore, he has to be given credit for innovation and frontline care and commitment. I've written a book on a chap called Guthrie, who was the guy who was nicknamed the English Larrey. He's a very robust character, occasionally confrontational, completely aghast at quite a lot of things that his colleagues did, just like Larrey. He has very much the same sort of qualities, except perhaps he wasn't quite so vainglorious, but he was technically a very able surgeon. He became president of the English College of Surgeons 3 times. His name was George Guthrie. So Guthrie and Larrey probably are the 2 men who really are outstanding in the French wars, and they lead us into a great dream of admiration and examples to follow.
Yeah. Well, I recommend my listeners please check out Mick Crumplin's book on Guthrie and all of his other books on medical care during this period. And I really thank you for that biography on Larrey. I think that was terrific, and I learned a lot, and hopefully my listeners did as well.